Welcome to the Unreal Engine 5 guided tour. In this video, I'll do my best to cover as many interesting aspects for newcomers as I can. Now no time to waste, let's get started. As a quick heads up, I've already enabled a couple of plugins and project settings, and I'll call them out as I go through if you want to follow along. That said, if you want to do them all at once, just check out the project description below. Let's begin with one of my favorite features that came in late during Unreal Engine 4, the Sky Atmosphere system. For those unfamiliar with it, the engine now has a full system in place for handling the sun, atmosphere, volumetric clouds, and fog. As a note, you can hold Ctrl-L and move your cursor to easily reposition the sun. Let's create a blank map and create the system from scratch. I'm going to go File, New, and select an empty map. It's actually really easy to set up. All you need to do is open the Environment Light Mixer, and we actually have a button for each element necessary for a foundational setup. I'd advise against pressing just one of them though. Don't add the second atmospheric light, as it's not really needed for a conventional outdoor lighting setup. As I mentioned before, you can now use Ctrl-L and the cursor to easily preview the sun and get it into the position that you want it to be in. Now that we've got those in place, let's get going and have a creative space to actually play in. I'm going to use a tool called CubeGrid in the modeling tools to block out a simple space. Using CubeGrid is relatively easy. You draw out a grid, and you can hit Q or E to make it go up or down. You can also select a region and hold Ctrl-click to drag it up and down. By selecting a region and hitting Z, you can actually go ahead and create ramps easily. And don't forget, you can always carve out into space. Lumen will kick in the second you click Complete on the model. For this space, I'm going to build one large room with two doorways. I'm going to have a little walkway inside that kind of goes over an area, and I'm going to cut in some holes at the top so that we've got some space for Lumen. You'll notice that from time to time I actually shift the grid up and down manually. I'm doing that with Shift E and Shift Q. You can also change the size of the grid with Ctrl E and Ctrl Q. Cool, so the space is crafted. First, let's make sure that our skylight, which represents the ambient light of the world, is fully dynamic. I'm going to enable real-time capture to do so. You'll notice that the room seems a little too foggy as well. That's because it's not really taking into account the light properly. Now, a cool feature that we have in Unreal is volumetric fog. If you go to your exponential height fog, you can see a little checkbox for volumetric fog. By enabling that, we have this great look now where the fog is caught by the light as it comes into the room. I really kind of love it. With that in play, it's time for us to no longer use this checkerboard pattern and have something that's a little bit prettier. For this, I'm going to use Quixel Bridge. Now, a little while ago, Epic Games acquired an amazing company called Quixel and opened up their Megascans to all Unreal Engine developers for free within Unreal Engine projects. So, what does this mean? Well, if you open your content browser by pressing Ctrl Space, you can right-click and click Add Quixel Content to launch Bridge. From here, I can search through the thousands of meshes and surfaces available to find something just right for what we're making. I'm going to grab this concrete and add it to my project. To do so, all I need to do is select the asset that I want, click Download, and then when it's downloaded, click Add. I can then just drag in the instance. We can see that it's a little bit too tiled, so I'm going to go ahead and change the tiling in the material instance. Now, it doesn't have to just be surfaces though. I can add decals, which project onto surfaces, as well as static meshes too. I'm going to set up a scene with this rocky ground, a tree, and a fireplace. Want to know something cool? Well, each of these rock meshes on the ground that I'm adding is actually over 1 million polys. And this highlights one amazing feature of Unreal Engine 5 that I've casually gone and implemented here, which is Nanite. Now, Nanite is Unreal Engine 5's virtualized geometry system, and it allows you to create super high quality meshes, often ones that don't even have to have normal maps, and import them into your scenes. You can instance them again and again, and the performance against traditional meshing is really quite incredible. One aspect of Nanite meshes that I love is that due to the density, they can actually blend together really nicely. Historically, these two meshes would have likely had some Z fighting on the surface. However, in this scenario, the little bumps and imperfections make them blend together quite well. Another thing that I really like is that decals work wonderfully with Nanite too. So I'm going to super quickly create a puddle decal material and apply that. This is literally just going to be a radial gradient with some noise around the edges to create a puddle-like visual. Now, don't worry about having to replicate this yourself. You can always copy this graph, or you could import a decal from within Quixel Bridge. But anyway, as you can see, decals work really well with Nanite meshes, since the mesh data helps break it up a lot and actually informs the height values that are there. In case you're wondering about how they behave on older consoles or mobile, don't stress. Under the hood, we actually automatically generate a nanite fallback mesh that has a more traditional poly count, and this mesh will get loaded instead of the other one on those older systems without having to manually fiddle with it. That said, you can fiddle with it and change the approximation values if you want to dial it in a bit. Now, in setting this up, we've been kinda overlooking something. You know how from the moment I created this environment, the light just accurately bounced around? That's Lumen. Lumen is the default global illumination and reflection system in Unreal Engine 5. It renders diffuse interreflection with infinite bounces and indirect specular reflections in large, detailed environments at scales ranging from millimeters to kilometers. I like it because, honestly, it just means light behaves like I'd want it to. I don't have to set up fake bounces, and beyond all that, it presents a nice unified pipeline for lighting, which, as a developer, makes me incredibly happy. Now, first off, that means that elements like source radius and source length on your point lights create more realistic lighting representations. See how the edges here get softer? It's subtle, but it really contributes a lot to your scene. Now, I want to go ahead and test something else with Lumen, but to do it, we're going to need another room. So I'm quickly just going to add a doorway here and a second room, and we'll go into that. Because if I go and I add a sphere to the scene, and then I go through and I create a really straightforward emissive material and apply it to that sphere, we see something kind of cool. And that is that, yep, emissive contributes to the lumen representation. Now what this means is that little lights in your scenes that are part of your meshes now help actually light the environment. As we move away from this sphere, we can see the light disappear though. So we need to go ahead and investigate this. Now here's where it's important to look at a new tool for analyzing your lumen representation. Simply go to View Modes and select Lumen Overview. You can see what's being represented by lumen here. Now, if this is a problem, you can simply drop into post-processing volume and increase the lumen scene detail. I'm going to begin by going ahead and actually setting the post-process to have an infinite extent though. Now, a post-processing volume changes what your screen sees after the core image has been rendered. In this situation, it says, hey, don't actually constrict these options to just be what's inside the volume, but rather apply it to everything else in the world. This means this is kind of like the default post-process now, and other volumes would override it. You can see here that as I've changed this to override the scene detail, that now that light is being correctly included, which means everything is pretty much how I want it to be. In case you're wondering, this essentially just changes the minimum size of objects that are getting picked up at various distances, so that they get culled appropriately. Now, often the values that are there as default work pretty well, but sometimes you do need to tinker with them a little bit. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and fix a couple of other post-processing things. I'm going to go stir crazy if I don't fix up the bloom just a little bit and the exposure levels so that they're a little less harsh for the kind of scene that we're building. Dialing this in, I think, is going to be important for, making sure everything looks good for the rest of this presentation. So now that that's up and running, what's up next? Niagara. Niagara is Unreal Engine's next generation VFX system, and it's been around since reasonably late in UE4's lifecycle. There are some new toys for it packed in with UE5 though, so I'm going to go ahead and create something basic to begin with. I'm going to create something that's based on a fountain system, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to modify it as appropriate. I'm going to call this ns_sci-fi particles. Inside of Niagara, we can see that we have our fountain emitter. From here, we can see we have a few different sections. Particle spawn is responsible for what happens when a particle is created. Update for whenever that particle is ticking over. Emitter update is what happens as the emitter itself is updating. Let's increase the spawn rate to see what that does. Now we can see that that's creating more particles. I could, for instance, change it so that we have less gravity on every update. So I've set that to -20. If I was to delete the initial add velocity, we can see those particles aren't moving when they're first spawned. I'm going to increase the shape location here to 205. That gives us a big circle, but we can see the particles aren't distributed on the surface, they're all through it. You can fix that by setting this surface distribution value to 1. Now, we have something that's looking a bit nicer, a little bit more sci-fi, but let's go on from here. In my particle update, I'm going to add a curl noise. Curl noise is great because it's kind of like random noise. And if I set a value to 1500 and the frequency to 5, we get something that's a little bit more sci-fi. However, I actually want to process this before we add drag. because by setting the drag values to 6, it's now slowing down after it adds that force, which gets us this way more sci-fi kind of look. Let's go ahead and get some more particles. I'm going to go and change this from a CPU emitter to a GPU emitter in the emitter's properties. The reason I'm doing this is because I can now have way more. Whenever you create a GPU emitter, you need to set the bounds to be static. Let's see what that big number looks like. That's a bit nicer. With this in place, I'm now going to start to dial in the colors. Let's get something a little bit more goldy, just to match the sphere that we have inside the world already. By default, every particle is always facing you. A cool thing that we can do is set the alignment of these particles so that they actually go along the velocity direction. So as the particle moves through space, it's kind of stretching along that way. This means that I can go down to the bottom to the sprite renderer and change the value to be velocity aligned. If I was to go back to my initialized properties, I can see that it's possible for us to actually set the initial size to be different on the X and Y axes. Let's take a look at how that goes. I think that's giving us something that feels a bit more like sparks, which is really what we want for the sci-fi effect. Let's take a quick look at that in the world. I'd say this holds up pretty well. We've really got that sci-fi look, so I think we can move on from here. Because it's cool, but we've all seen particles before. But one new thing in Unreal's bag of tricks is the addition of the Niagara Fluids plugin. Let's go ahead and create a new emitter based on the fire example that we have here. I'm going to call this NS Campfire. Now, if I go ahead and I create this effect, I want you to take a look at it in the world. Notice anything kind of different about it? Let's put it in slow motion. That's right, it's volumetric. Now, I really love this, and I'm just going to say, look, I'm not going to go into it fully here because we just don't have the time and it's a video unto itself, but essentially it uses two emitters. One creates particles that injects information into another, which then runs a fluid simulation on that. There are additional examples in the plugin for explosions, water, and more too, so if you're a VFX artist looking to level up, I highly recommend you check them out because I think they're really exciting. Just don't forget to disable the overlays when you've put one in the world, otherwise you'll end up with that red box. Now, speaking of volumetrics, another late UE4 feature that has been enhanced by Lumen is placeable fog. To get this started, I'm going to need to add a sphere to the scene, which we're going to apply a material to. Now, in UE5, you can create materials that exist in the volume domain, which allows you to inject them into the volumetric fog pass. So here I'm going to go ahead and create a clean spherical falloff and set that as the extinction on a material. I've also gone ahead and I've set the albedo to a value of 1, which means we'll have white fog coming in. Now, when this has been compiled and applied to a material, it actually creates a volumetric fog mesh. It's cool, right? Like, it really adds something to the scene. Now, we can also go ahead and we can tinker this a little bit because it's nice like this. But if we want, we can subtract some noise from a volume texture, much like we did with the decal, but in 3D. So this will create a more smoky look. Again, like, don't stress if you can't just whip up one of these materials on the spot. I'm doing my best to kind of freeze frame on some of these shots, but in addition to this, we'll do our best to get some tutorials up in the near future for the community to access more readily. Finally, if we add panning to the z-axis, we can actually create smoke that slowly moves up over time. Now, the great thing about this kind of fog is that it's really, really easy for level designers to author, and it really just helps bring a scene to life. And I strongly recommend any tech artists out there and VFX artists to consider this approach in their scenes. Because at the end of the day, even though there's panning and volumetric noise in this, you can do a lot more. As a tech artist, you could easily see how close the smoke is to the nearest surface to react differently. Or you could use custom primitive data to have a per fog parameter that you could change to easily tweak. Before we go outside, I want to quickly add some music in the other room for a bit of a vibe. Here I'm going to leverage UE5's meta sounds to create some cool ambience for this room. Now, while what I'm about to do is essentially make a synth, I want you to remember that you can make full audio spectrums using metasounds, and I strongly recommend checking it out. To begin with, I'm going to go ahead and I'm create a sine node. Now, this just takes a frequency and then it plays that frequency. I'm going to set it to 200 and we can hear it now. Alright, it's not exactly Mozart, but a cool thing is we can get that frequency and we can actually set it to play something based on a given MIDI note. So here you can see that I've added a MIDI note quantizer on a minor scale, and I'm going to just randomly read in a number each time. That's cool. Now, instead of me mashing the play button, how about I put in a trigger repeat and set it to a given BPM? Cool. So how about we actually make that volume drop off? I'm going to add an envelope. This means that whenever it plays the note, it kind of fades away as the note plays. Alright, that's cool. How about we grab all of this and we play it over the top of itself? Another thing I can do is I can look at the currently playing note up above, and I can find another note that's pretty close to it by just getting that value and adding an offset random instead of something that's specifically set to be in the range. That way it's always a little bit closer to the note that I'm currently playing. Cool, and we can change how frequently those other notes play. See how easy that was? I really love doing this. Let's go ahead and put that into the world. Okay, so I'm going to just drag this in. But it's also a good idea for me to set up a little bit of attenuation. So I'm just going to override the attenuation so that it just fades off as we move away from it. And that's it for the most relaxing part of this video. It's time for us to pick up the pace again, go outside, and build an environment. To begin with, I think we should probably rough out a bit of a shell for these buildings to keep marketing off my back. Once again, I'm just going to open up CubeGrid and whip something up. So this will kind of just add a little bit of detail. We don't just have a single box in our environment. But with this done, I think it's a good idea for me to go a little bit further and start to look at actually going forward with a landscape that we've really set up. Now, for this landscape, we're going to do something cool, and that is that we're going to leverage the water and landmass plugins. To begin with, we're just going to create a landscape from the landscape mode panel. Make sure you have enable edit layers checked, or these plugins won't work. Now we can see that this is in play, and if I wanted to, I could just paint and sculpt straight into the world, but we're going to do something cooler than that. We're going to go ahead and we're going to add a blueprint brush to our scene, and we're going to select landmass. And you'll see that when I add this, it adds 3 little dots connected with some lines. And that's because landmass lets me actually paint into the world with splines. In addition to letting you paint with splines, we have a bunch of other options. For instance, we can cap the shape, we can add curl noise, we can add displacement, and all of this compiles to kind of create a much more realistic but easy to iterate upon environment. Also be aware that you can stack multiple land masses on top of one another to kind of create mountain ranges or whatever you need. I'm not going to do that here. But for the next step of what I'd like to do, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to my standard select mode, and I'm just going to drop in an ocean. Now, the water systems in Unreal are actually pretty straightforward. You can drop in oceans, lakes, and rivers, and the materials actually automatically combine information so that rivers will correctly flow into oceans and lakes into rivers, etc., etc. It's actually a really exciting system to have, and it being able to manipulate the landscape beneath it is really cool. Plus, there's a bunch of properties that you can work with to change things, such as how steep the beach layers are and how the fall off looks. I really love this for getting a scene up and running quickly. And as before, there's just a really easy iteration time that you have available. If you have some mistakes that require a special personal touch, you can create an additional edit layer and you can just paint those out. So this adds something on top that'll say, hey, subtract this area and sculpt it out. And this means that we can keep it, both procedural, but still have the custom touches that are required to get the visuals that we're after. Speaking of the visuals that we're after, let's go back to Quixel. I'm going to grab 3 sands and some beach rocks and a concrete bollard that might help, imply that there was a pier at some stage or something there. So let's go ahead and bring them in. With those in, I think it's time for us to set up a landscape material that we can use. So to begin with, we're going to do the obvious thing, and that is we're going to drag some sand textures in. And now, while we could plug them in like we normally would, it's worth noting that Unreal lets you create materials inside of materials in a way. And it does this through the material attributes type. And once we do that, we can actually blend them together. And this is a really great way to make landscapes. You just need to make sure you have the use material attributes boolean checked in the properties of the material. Once this is done, you can go ahead and use a set material attributes property to kind of actually just plug them in the same way you would if this was the standard output. Now, by doing it this way, we have kind of created like a little mini material that runs through a single wire at the end here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this again for the wet material. The cool thing here is that when we add a landscape layer blend, we can blend the two of these things together. So I'm going to make a sand and I'm going to make a wet sand. I'm going to plug them both into each other and I'm going to go back to my landscape in the world. Now when I do so, I just need to apply the material and then in the landscape settings, add a weighted layer blend to both of them, which is as simple as clicking that plus button. And you can see that we can now paint in wet sand. Now it's tiling a bit too much, and that's okay. We can go back and we can fix up the landscape coordinates on the two materials. While I'm at it, I'm also going to go ahead and add the trampled on sand that I pulled down from Quixel. The trick to getting this one to work is to just use the blend material attributes node, and that'll automatically just blend all of the layers of those materials. And I'm going to add that to my main sand blend, so we end up with a slightly nicer result that kind of blends between some trampled on sand and some regular sand, just to break up the scene a little bit. Now, with that locked away, it's time for us to use the foliage tool. So just go into the foliage mode and drag in the mesh that you want to use. In this case, I'm going to use the Thai beach rocks. And I suggest lowering the height offset and using an average normal. This means that when we paint them in, they'll stick into the ground a little bit more, and they won't be as drastically attached to the ground's direction. Now by doing this, we can then just hold down click or shift click to just paint the rocks into the world. And this is going to work reasonably nicely for setting up our scenes. It's worth noting that each of these is a nanite mesh, and I'm painting in like 1,000 of them, and the computer doesn't really flinch. I'm also going to use this opportunity to kind of go through and start to paint out the wet sand around the rim of the island. And after I kind of paint in that wet sand, I think it'd be a really good idea for me to go through and kind of smooth that out somewhat, just so that we end up with a slightly more natural gradient leading into it. I could spend a lot more time on this and adding many more landscape layers, but I won't invest too much time, or at least I'll try not to. That way we can really get this looking a little bit nicer. In addition to the Thai rock, I'm also going to paint in a little bit more foliage, which will be some thatching grass, which is from Quixel as well. I'm going to make sure I scale this up so that it doesn't quite look as nasty as that first one did. I think that was intended to be a little bit denser. But just getting in some thatching grass will really kind of break this scene up quite nicely. And I think this is going to work okay once I'm done. So this is all well and good, but I still have an issue with the scene, which is one last thing I'd really love to fix, which is, when stuff touches the sand, it just kind of sticks into it. It doesn't blend or anything. Well, we can fix that. And we can fix that with a concept called a runtime virtual texture. Now, a runtime virtual texture lets you dynamically capture certain objects to a texture called a virtual texture. Now, this is really, really useful because it means you can then blend that material into any object in the scene. So in this case, we're going to capture 2 RVTs, the environment material and the height of the landscape. RVTs require a bit of a checklist to implement, but once they're in, and anything can use them relatively painlessly from that point onwards. Step 1 is creating the 2 runtime virtual texture assets. We're going to call one RVT underscore environment and another RVT underscore height. Make sure you open up the height RVT and set the value to height. Now, that's step 1. Step 2 means creating a bounds volume and setting it to be the size of the landscape and setting the RVT onto that one. You'll need to do it twice, once for each of the runtime virtual texture volumes. So just drop in a runtime virtual texture volume and then set those values. Now, step 3 involves changing the landscape material. We now need to set up a new output node that is to tell it, hey, when someone uses a runtime virtual texture on you, this is what to output. There's a couple of gotchas here, but you should be able to run all of the pins across as required, except for the normal. The normal you'll need to translate into world space by adding a transform vector and go from tangent to world space. And to get the world height, you'll need to get the world position and then only get the B channel, which refers to the Z axis. Again, don't stress too much if this is a little bit above your head. You only really need to do it once, and you can copy it from this video or our online tutorials. Now, the final step in setting them up is to simply assign those two RVTs on the landscape itself, which says, hey, you're contributing to the runtime virtual textures. Now, with that all set up, you're ready to set up the blend on the material itself. So to get this part going, what we need to do is open the parent material for the Quixel asset. Once we've opened this up, we're going to start setting up a blend. To make things a little easier to understand, I'm going to do the blend first and just blend it to the color red. Now, to get that set up, I'm going to use the blend material attributes node that we used in the landscape material earlier. And I'm going to set the pin to be just, like I said, a red color. Now, you can't just plug it straight in. You will need to assign a material attribute if you want to run a test value like this. It's the pains of having a slightly more complicated setup, but the rest of it is easier because of it. So we're going to add a runtime virtual texture sample and set that to be the world height. After we have that in place, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to compare it to the world height that we have of the current object. So it says, hey, let's look at my height and subtract the world height of the landscape. If it's a positive value, we're above it. If it's negative, we're below it. By dividing it by a number, we can see that, we can blend by 10, for instance. It'll say, hey, when we're 10 centimeters away, that's a full blend away from it. Let's take a look at that. You can see here that it's now red where it's touching and it's black the rest of it. So it's actually picking up where the ground is. Let's go ahead and remove the set material attributes node and instead set up the runtime virtual texture setup that we want to have. So I'm going to do another runtime virtual texture sample, this time sampling the environment texture, and I'm just going to plug these values in. And when I plug these values in, we're going to be able to set this up as the blended in material. Be aware that in the same way that you passed the normal from tangent to world space before, you now need to get that same normal and convert it back from world space to tangent space. So with world to tangent set up, that will now correctly blend in the angles of your material too. So I'm just going to delete that material attributes node and click apply. Back in the world, we can now see that any of these objects, when they touch the sand, will automatically blend in. Even if we paint something under it, it will now get the newly painted material instead. And we can try this on all sorts of assets. So let's kind of drop something in. Let's drop in those bollards that I mentioned before. We can see here that they're comfortably blending in. It's a good idea for us to tinker with a couple of other assets too. But if I get something like this bollard and I kind of handle this blend, I can get some really, really nice looks. And it's great because, as I said before, once you do this in something like the base Quixel shader, all of those Quixel assets are really just going to behave like you would want them to. And you can set the scene up really, really well, and just everything kind of suits the world a little bit more. And it's a really, really great technique that we've been pushing pretty heavily. And I'm super excited to show this to folks every time. Now, one thing I really want to touch on as well in this video is just a reminder that we're always giving out free content on the marketplace, and that free content is, if it worked in UE4, there's an incredibly high chance that it works in UE5 as well. One of the perks of Epic making games is that we've really had to push some pretty aggressive backwards compatibility for a lot of our concepts. So by having something like this, I can go ahead and I can just drop in UE4 boats pack that was made for Twinmotion, and I can put them into the scene. I can use that as a nice way to decorate things up. But I really just wanted to stress it because it's very easy for folks to think, well, 5 is one more, therefore none of the stuff from 4 is compatible. But a lot of it actually still works, and it's exciting to use. So for the last part of this session, I'm going to cheat. I'll admit I prepared something earlier. I'm going to bring in a tentacle from the Kraken asset on the marketplace. Now, I've limited it to just the tentacle to just cut some time out of this presentation and to, not spend too much time rigging up an entire creature. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a control rig for this asset. Now, control rig is a node-based rigging system. It's designed to provide riggers and animators with tools to create flexible, dynamic, and procedural characters with artist-friendly interfaces. Unlike Blueprint, Control Rig uses its own lighter-weight VM called RigVM to provide highly efficient pose calculations. So in this scenario, we're going to set up two simple controls for this tentacle, and then create an animation for it. To create a control rig for something, simply right-click on the existing mesh and click Create Control Rig. We're going to create our first control rig now. To begin with, I want to point the tentacle in a given direction. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call Set Rotation. Now, we need to tell it which of these bones is the parent for the rest of the rotation. So I'm going to call Tentacle 1. You can see that it's rotating. We need to inform this, though, a direction to rotate. So I'm going to create a new control. And we're going to use this new control, which I'm going to call Base Rotation Control, as a way of directing this. Now, to do so, I just need to drag it into the graph and click Get Control. You'll notice that you can't just connect transform to the rotation. You need to actually drop down and get the rotation to connect to the rotation. And there, with that connected, we now have something that's actually functional. So we can see that that rotation is now modifying the tentacle, which is what we want. However, when I hit compile, it resets. That's because you need to get the control and tell it that its current transform is the default. So you actually, by hitting compile there, it's now going to show us that it's always defaulting to that position. So that's great. So now that we've got the base rotation, let's go ahead and set up the reach point by setting up a full body IK node. Now, full body IK is a bit of an advanced node to use for this one little tentacle, but a cool feature of it is that it's able to have multiple effectors. So you could actually use this full body IK node to drive an entire Kraken. Now, the full body IK node needs to know some stuff. It needs to know what the root is, which in this case is just the root. It also needs to have some sort of effector, which tells it what to reach towards. I'm going to tell it that tentacle 15 is reaching towards a position. By default, it's going to be 0, so it's crushing in on itself. So let's create a new control that I'm going to call Reach Control. Now, Reach Control, we're going to drag in and we're going to set it up. And we're going to connect the transform to our full body IK. And you'll notice that when I drag it up, it's kind of working, but we're getting some kind of strange behavior. That's because full body IK can be a bit of a strange one when reacting to large chains. So I'm going to set the pull chain alpha to 0, and I'm just going to increase the mass. And that'll give me a more realistic setup there. So that's actually working, which is great. Now let's look at a few issues. We can see that it's folding in on itself, and there's a little bit of a bob going on there. So let's fix these one at a time. To begin with, I'm going to set the initial offset from the current, same fix as we had before. However, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a rotation and it's 90 degrees off. So we're going to correct that too, and once again, set offset transform from current. Of course, there was one other little issue that we were facing, which is if I pull it up, it disconnects. So in this case, I'm going to set the root behavior to be pinned to the input, at which point the tentacle is now staying where it should, and we're able to have simple controls to guide what it's doing. This is really, really useful, but those controls are hard to see, so let's go ahead and fix those. I'm going to select Reach Control, and I'm going to set it to be a scale of 8. And you can now see that it's a big red ball, which is great, because it gives me something to guide it with. I'm also going to go to Base Rotation Control, and I'm going to set it to be a size of 8 as well. However, this is it's probably best for us to have something that's a bit easier to see. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this to be a thick wedge, which gives us a shape, which is a little bit easier for working out which way that control is pointing. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and apply this to the world. When you go to drop a control rig in the world, it actually goes ahead and sets some controls up for you, which is great. So if I go back to my content browser and I drag the control rig into the world, we can see when I let go that it actually loads up Sequencer. And the cool part of this means that I can use Unreal Engine's Sequencer to actually rig what this animation is going to do. And that's really powerful because I can kind of set these bone directions up, I can tell them which way to face, and I can keyframe it using the tools that we're already familiar with for all of our standard cinematics. And in this situation, I'm just going to drop it in there, and I'm going to go ahead and add keyframes to both of those controls to kind of get something that looks a little bit wiggly and menacing over the island. It's a good idea to grab those two initial keyframes and alt drag them to the other side as well so that we're starting and ending at the same location. In this situation though, I'm just gonna kind of get something that I think will work. And with this kind of generally working, what we're gonna go ahead and do now is we're gonna create a linked animation. So a cool thing here is that if you right click, you can actually go create linked animation sequence. And what this does is this actually saves out what you've just done as an animation that you can use in the conventional Unreal Engine pipeline. In my situation, I'm just going to save it out as an idle animation, and then I'm going to set the animation mode to be playing an animation. And when I do that reset, I'm just going to flag that it will kind of reset the values because I set the transform in the sequencer, so it did kind of get small again. But again, that's really easy for me to fix. And let's take a look at what that does when it's got another one with it as well. Great. So this is kind of a weird demo. We now have an island that we've created pretty much from scratch with some wiggly tentacles going on. Again, that we created the animations for. We've got landscape blending, we've gone through Niagara, we've gone through Lumen, we've gone through Nanite, we've gone through Control Rig, we've gone through landmass, we've gone through water. So there's a lot here in UE5, and I'm super excited for what's here in 5.0, let alone what the future will bring. I hope this session has been really useful for everybody. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Chris Murphy, and this has been a pleasure. Have a good day.